Charles, 38 years old, as a humanitarian aid worker specializing in crisis zones across East Africa, he had spent a decade delivering supplies to places most people only saw on the news: refugee camps, drought-stricken villages, conflict zones. In this unforgiving landscape where human resilience and desperation collided daily, there was almost nothing he hadn't witnessed. But today was different. Under the oppressive afternoon heat, Charles was checking his radiator in the shade of his broken-down Land Rover, calculating how far he'd have to walk to reach the nearest village. But then, carried on the hot wind, a sound reached his ears that didn't belong. Not voices, not animals, something else. The moment he instinctively followed that sound past the crumbling buildings of the abandoned village, Charles's breath caught in his throat. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. Behind a collapsed circus tent was a rusted metal cage, and inside it was a fully grown male lion. Nothing but matted golden fur stretched over visible ribs, lying motionless in a space barely large enough to contain him. And around his entire body was the cage itself, metal bars so close together the lion couldn't even stand upright. In 10 years of aid work across the continent, it was an unbelievable sight he had never seen before. The lion lifted its head slightly, then let it fall back down, its breath coming in shallow, labored gasps. It looked utterly defeated. After a moment, its amber eyes opened and found Charles standing there. It didn't look away. It just watched him with an intensity that made Charles's heart hammer against his ribs. It looked like a king reduced to a prisoner, using its last reserves of dignity just to hold that gaze. Charles approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the dried earth. The closer he got, the more horrific the situation became. The lion was so emaciated that every bone in its frame was visible, and where the metal bars had pressed against its shoulders, the fur was worn away completely, leaving raw, scarred skin beneath. The cage was rusted through in places, surrounded by empty water bowls and scattered bones, evidence that someone had been trying to keep the animal alive, but barely. The lion didn't threaten Charles at all as he approached. It simply watched, those fierce amber eyes tracking every movement, as if asking a question Charles couldn't yet understand. "What took you so long?" "King." Charles stood frozen before the cage, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. A lion, a full-grown African lion, in a village so remote it didn't appear on most maps, trapped in a cage that looked like it had been welded together from scrap metal and desperation. "How long?" Charles asked, though there was no one nearby to answer. The question hung in the scorching air, unanswered but essential. How long had this magnificent creature been dying in plain sight? He turned toward the collapsed tent, toward the faded banner that still clung to a broken pole. The paint was peeling, but he could still make out the words, "Faraji's Spectacular Circus of Wonders." Below it, in smaller letters that had mostly flaked away, Est 1987. What remained of the tent was sun-bleached canvas and rotting rope. A rusted trapeze bar lay half-buried in red dirt. Wooden crates that might have once held props or equipment were scattered like bones across the abandoned lot. This had been someone's dream once, someone's livelihood. Now it was a graveyard. Charles walked the perimeter of the site, piecing together the story from the debris. More cages, smaller ones, their doors hanging open or torn completely off their hinges. Animal feed sacks, long empty, their corners chewed through by rats. A water truck with flat tires and a cracked windshield. Posters advertising performances in 3 languages, promises of amazement and wonder. Dates from 2 years ago that had come and gone without shows. The heat pressed down on him like a physical weight as he returned to the lion's cage. The animal had shifted slightly, its massive head turning to track Charles's movements. Those amber eyes, they held something that made Charles's chest tighten. Not fear, not aggression, something worse. Resignation mixed with a flicker of something that looked impossibly like hope. "I need to understand what happened here," Charles said, aloud, more to himself than to the lion. He pulled out his satellite phone, no cell service out here, and was about to call his regional coordinator when he heard footsteps behind him. An elderly woman approached carrying a plastic bucket that sloshed with water. She was small, weathered by sun and hardship, wearing a faded dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. She stopped when she saw Charles, her eyes widening with something that looked like relief. "You are here for the lion," she said in Swahili, not a question but a statement of fact. "Finally, someone has come." Charles switched to Swahili, the language he'd learned to speak fluently during his years working across East Africa. "I just found him. Can you tell me what happened?" The woman, she introduced herself as Mama Njiri, set down her bucket and began to speak. The story poured out of her like water from a cracked vessel, as if she'd been waiting years to tell someone who might actually be able to do something about it. Faraji's circus had been struggling for years, she explained. The owner, a man named Hassan Faraji, had inherited the operation from his father and tried to keep it alive through sheer stubbornness. But the world had changed. People didn't want to see animals in cages anymore. Towns that used to welcome the circus with open arms now turned them away. The costs of feeding the animals, maintaining the equipment, paying the performers, it all became too much. 2 years ago, the circus had arrived in this village for what was supposed to be a 3-day engagement. But on the second night, Hassan received a phone call. His creditors had finally caught up with him. The banks were seizing everything. His performers, sensing disaster, had already begun to slip away in the night, taking whatever they could carry. By dawn, Hassan was gone too. He'd released some of the animals, a pair of aging zebras, 3 monkeys, a handful of birds, and they'd scattered into the scrubland, and no one knew if they'd survived. But the lion was different. Hassan had been afraid to release him, afraid the lion would attack the villagers, that children would be killed, that he'd be responsible for a massacre. So he'd left the lion in his cage with a week's worth of meat and water, and a handwritten sign that read, "I am sorry. Please care for him until I can return." Hassan never returned, and the villagers, poor as they were, had tried. Mama Njiri's voice cracked as she described how they'd pooled what little they had. A farmer would bring scraps of meat when he slaughtered a goat. Another villager would haul water from the well 2 kilometers away. Children would gather bones from their family meals and bring them to the cage, their small faces pressed against the bars, whispering apologies to the king they couldn't save. "We tried to call someone," Mama Njiri said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "The wildlife authorities, the government, anyone. But no one came. No one cared about a circus lion in a village that doesn't matter, and we are too poor to do more. We can barely feed our own children." Charles looked at the empty water bowls scattered around the cage, at the gnawed bones, at the evidence of a community doing everything it could with nothing to give. They hadn't abandoned the lion. They'd kept him alive against impossible odds, sustained by nothing but compassion and guilt. "How has he survived this long?" Charles asked quietly. Mama Njiri shook her head, as if the answer defied explanation. "We don't know. By all rights, he should have died months ago, but he doesn't. He just waits, like he's waiting for someone to keep a promise." Charles felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Not pity. He'd seen too much suffering to traffic in pity anymore. This was something deeper, something that felt like recognition. He'd spent 10 years moving from one crisis to the next, following protocols, filing reports, doing just enough to ease his conscience before moving on. He'd become efficient at caring without feeling, at helping without connecting. But this lion
This dying king who'd been abandoned by the man who'd imprisoned him and sustained by villagers who had nothing, was looking at him like he was supposed to be here, like his broken-down Land Rover and his wrong turn and his stumbling into this forgotten place weren't accidents at all. Charles knelt beside the cage, close enough to smell the matted fur, close enough to see the scars where the bars had worn grooves into his shoulders. The lion's breathing was shallow, labored, but those amber eyes remained fixed on Charles with unsettling intensity. "I'm going to get you out of here," Charles whispered. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to get you out." Behind him, Mamanjiri let out a sob that sounded like prayer. Charles sat in the shade of his broken-down Land Rover, his satellite phone pressed to his ear, listening to the regional wildlife coordinator explain in excruciating bureaucratic detail why rescuing the lion would take a minimum of 6 weeks. "There are protocols, Mr. Omandi," the voice on the other end said, using Charles's surname with the kind of detached professionalism that made his jaw clench. "We first need to verify the ownership status of the animal. Then there's the question of jurisdiction. Was the circus licensed? Who's responsible for the animal now? We'll need to file reports with 3 separate government agencies, possibly 4 if the circus crossed international borders. The lion is dying right now, not in 6 weeks. I understand your concern, but we have procedures for a reason. Without proper documentation, we could be charged with theft of private property. And then there's the matter of transport permits, veterinary clearances, finding an appropriate facility willing to take him." Charles ended the call. He stared at the phone in his hand, feeling the familiar weight of institutional inertia pressing down on him. 10 years of aid work had taught him that there were 2 ways the world operated, the right way and the way that actually saved lives. The right way involved forms and approvals and committees. The way that actually saved lives involved breaking rules and begging forgiveness later. He'd always chosen the right way, always followed protocol, always documented everything in triplicate. It's how you kept your job, how you maintained funding, how you ensured that next year's refugees would have someone to help them because you hadn't gotten yourself fired or arrested this year. But 10 years of choosing the right way had meant watching people die while he waited for approval signatures. Charles walked back to the cage. The lion hadn't moved except to follow him with those amber eyes that seemed to see straight through all his excuses. Mamanjiri had returned to her home, promising to bring more water at sunset. The village was quiet in the afternoon heat, the kind of profound silence that came from poverty so deep that even hope made noise by comparison. "What do I do?" Charles asked, though he already knew the answer. The question wasn't really what to do, it was whether he had the courage to do it. His phone rang. Not the satellite phone, his regular cell, which had somehow found a single bar of service. The caller ID showed his supervisor's name. Charles let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. "Charles, I just got a very concerned call from the wildlife coordinator. Something about you reporting an abandoned circus lion?" "That's correct." "Charles, I need you to listen carefully. Your job is..."
Dr. Elena Kimathi arrived 3 hours later in a dust-covered Jeep that had seen better decades. She was younger than Charles expected, maybe 30, with her hair pulled back in a practical bun and exhaustion written across her features in the way of someone who'd been working too many hours for too many years. She stepped out of the vehicle carrying a battered medical kit that looked like it had survived multiple safaris and at least 1 flood. "Show me," she said without preamble. Charles led her to the cage. Elena's professional composure cracked the moment she saw the lion. Her hand went to her mouth, and for a long moment she just stood there, her eyes moving over the animal's emaciated frame with a kind of clinical assessment that couldn't hide the horror beneath. "My God," she whispered, "how is he still alive?" That's what everyone keeps asking. No one has an answer. Elena knelt beside the cage, her movements slow and deliberate. The lion watched her, but didn't react with aggression. She studied his breathing pattern, the way his ribs expanded and contracted with each labored breath. She noted the pressure sores where the cage bars had worn through fur and skin. Her jaw tightened with each new observation. "This is going to be extremely dangerous," she said finally, standing and facing Charles. "He's severely malnourished, probably dehydrated despite the water the villagers have been giving him. His organs could be failing. His immune system is almost certainly compromised. The stress of sedation alone could kill him. But will you try?" Elena looked at him for a long moment, and Charles saw his own exhaustion reflected back at him. She was someone else who'd spent years following the rules, playing by the system, and watching it fail the creatures she'd sworn to protect. "Mom and Jerry told me you quit your job for this. Is that true?" "I didn't quit. I just stopped following orders." A ghost of a smile crossed Elena's face. "Yeah, I know how that goes." She turned it back to the lion. "I'll need help, at least 4 strong people to help move him once he's sedated, and I'll need to see that truck." Mom and Jerry's son Joseph had brought his flatbed truck, an ancient Toyota that looked like it had been assembled from parts of 3 different vehicles. The bed was lined with old blankets and tires to cushion the journey. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. By sunset, word had spread through the village. Charles found himself surrounded by volunteers, men and women who'd been quietly feeding the lion, keeping him alive through 2 years of impossible odds. There was Samuel, a farmer with hands like weathered leather, who donated goat meat when he could afford it. There was Grace, a school teacher who'd brought her students to see the lion, teaching them about compassion even when resources were scarce. There was Thomas, a mechanic who'd already begun assembling the tools they'd need to cut through the cage. They gathered around the truck as Elena laid out the plan. Her voice was steady, professional, but Charles could hear the underlying tension. This wasn't a textbook operation. This was improvisation built on prayer and determination. "The sedative I have is designed for animals in better health. I'm going to have to guess at the dosage based on his current weight, which is probably half what it should be. Too much, and we stop his heart. Too little, and he wakes up during the extraction." "What are our odds?" Samuel asked. Elena didn't sugarcoat it. "Honestly, maybe 50-50 that he survives the sedation. Lower odds that he survives the transport to the sanctuary, and that's assuming we can even get him out of this cage without causing more trauma." The villagers exchanged glances. No one walked away. "We've been keeping him alive for 2 years, Mom and Jerry said quietly. "We're not stopping now." Charles felt something tighten in his chest, a recognition of what he was seeing. These weren't naive idealists who didn't understand the risks. They were people who'd been living with impossible choices for so long that they'd learned to measure success not by guaranteed outcomes, but by the refusal to give up. They'd kept this lion alive when every rational voice said to let nature take its course. They'd chosen compassion over practicality, hope over resignation. They were showing Charles who he used to be, before 10 years of protocol had taught him to calculate costs and benefits, to triage suffering based on probability of success. "All right," Elena said, pulling out a vial and syringe from her kit. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to sedate him through the bars. I'll need to get close, and I'll need him calm. Charles, that's going to be your job. He seems to respond to you." Charles nodded, though he had no idea why the lion seemed to watch him with that particular intensity. He approached the cage slowly, kneeling in the same spot he'd occupied earlier. The lion's amber eyes tracked him, that strange recognition still burning in their depths. "Hey," Charles said softly, "we're going to get you out, but you have to trust us. You have to stay calm while we do this." The lion's breathing slowed slightly, not much, but enough that Elena could safely approach from the side. She moved with practiced efficiency, loading the syringe, calculating angles, waiting for the perfect moment. When it came, she was quick, the needle entering the lion's shoulder, the plunger depressing, the sedative entering his bloodstream. The lion flinched, but didn't roar, didn't attack, just looked at Charles with those unwavering eyes as the drug began to take effect. "How long?" Charles asked. 15 minutes, maybe 20. His metabolism is so compromised it's hard to predict." Elena pulled out more equipment, monitoring devices, additional syringes in case they needed to adjust the dosage. "Once he's under, we'll have maybe 45 minutes to get him out and loaded before I need to administer the reversal agent. If we can't do it in that time—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Thomas had already positioned his cutting equipment beside the cage. Samuel and 3 other men stood ready with the blankets they'd used to carry the lion. Grace had organized the children to keep watch for any government vehicles that might be approaching. Everyone had a role. Everyone understood the stakes. The lion's eyes began to droop. His massive head lowered slowly to the cage floor. His breathing deepened, steadied as the sedative pulled him under. For the first time in 2 years, the vigilant watching stopped. The waiting ended. Charles placed his hand against the cage bars, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the lion's body. "We've got you now," he whispered. "I promise." Behind him, Thomas fired up the cutting torch. Sparks flew in the gathering darkness as metal began to yield to determination. The rescue, impossible, illegal, desperate, had begun. And somewhere in his sedated dreams, the lion waited to see if promises, this time, would actually be kept. The sound of the cutting torch was louder than Charles expected, a high-pitched scream of metal surrendering to flame. Sparks cascaded in orange arcs, illuminating Thomas's concentrated face as he worked methodically through the first bar. The lion lay motionless inside, his massive chest rising and falling in the deep, steady rhythm of sedation. "Vitals are holding," Elena called out, her fingers pressed against the lion's neck where she'd found a pulse point. She had a stethoscope draped around her neck and kept one eye on her watch. "But his heart rate is lower than I'd like. We need to move fast." The first bar came free with a metallic clang. Thomas moved to the second, adjusting his angle. The cage had been built with brutal efficiency, thick steel bars welded at joints that had rusted together over years of neglect. Each cut took precious minutes they didn't have. Charles knelt beside Elena, watching her work. She had attached a portable heart monitor to the lion's chest, the wires running under his matted mane. The screen showed a pattern Charles didn't fully understand, but the worry in Elena's eyes told him everything he needed to know. "How much time?" Charles asked. "We're at 18 minutes in sedation. I need him out in the next 25, or we're going to have serious complications." She looked up at Thomas. "Can we speed this up?" "Not without risking the torch slipping and brunning him," Thomas said, not pausing in his work. Sweat poured down his face despite the cooling evening air. "These welds are thicker than they looked." The second bar fell away, then the third. Each one opened the cage a little more, revealing the full extent of what 2 years of confinement had done to him. The lion's shoulder blades jutted at sharp angles. His hindquarters were wasted, muscle atrophied from lack of movement. Where the bars had pressed against him, the scarring was worse than Charles had initially seen. Deep grooves worn into flesh that had tried to heal around metal that never moved. "God," Samuel breathed, from where he stood ready with the blankets. "How did we let this happen?" "We didn't let anything happen," Mom and Jerry said firmly. "We did what we could with what we had. Now we do more." The fourth bar came free. Thomas paused, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "That should be enough space to slide him out, but we'll need to be careful. His shoulders are going to be tight getting through." Elena checked her watch again. 18 minutes. We're running out of time. She looked at the assembled volunteers. "When I give the signal, we lift together. Support his spine. I don't want any twisting. His bones are probably brittle from malnutrition." Charles positioned himself at the lion's head. Up close, the lion was impossibly magnificent and heartbreaking than he had realized. The mane, though matted and filthy, still held traces of the golden magnificence it had once been. The paws, massive even in their emaciated state, were tipped with claws that could have torn through flesh, but had spent 2 years scraping uselessly against metal. "On 3, Elena said. 1, 2, 3. They lifted together. The lion was shockingly light, maybe 300 pounds when he should have been 500. Charles felt the bones shift under his hands, felt the fragility of what should have been apex strength. They maneuvered him through the opening Thomas had created, moving inches at a time, rotating his shoulders to clear the remaining bars. And then he was free, out of the cage for the first time in 732 days. His body lay on the blanket Samuel and the others had spread on the ground, looking impossibly vulnerable in the open air. "Transport blanket, now," Elena ordered. They positioned a larger canvas stretcher beside the lion and carefully rolled him onto it.
6 people lifted the corner.
The road deteriorated into little more than packed dirt 30 minutes outside the village. The truck bounced over ruts and rocks, each jolt making Charles wince as he imagined what it was doing to the lion's fragile body. Elena braced herself in the truck bed, one hand on the lion's chest, the other gripping the side rail. "Slower!" she shouted over the engine noise. "His heart rate spikes every time we hit a bump." Joseph eased off the accelerator, but the road didn't cooperate. It was barely maintained, carved through scrubland that seemed determined to reclaim it. In the distance, the sun had fully set, leaving them with only the truck's struggling headlights to guide them. Charles twisted in his seat, watching Elena work through the rear window. She'd set up a makeshift IV drip using a water bottle suspended from the truck's roll bar. The fluid line ran into the lion's foreleg, a thin lifeline of hydration for a body that had been slowly dying of thirst despite the villagers' efforts. "Talk to me, Elena," Charles called back. "How's he doing?" "Honestly, not good." Her face was drawn tight with concentration. "His temperature is dropping. That's either the sedation or early shock. I've given him everything I can to stabilize him, but his body is just too compromised. 2 years of malnutrition doesn't heal in 3 hours. The monitor beeped irregularly, and Charles saw Elena's expression darken. She pulled out her stethoscope, listening to the lion's chest cavity, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is it?" Charles asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Fluid in the lungs. Early stages of pneumonia, probably. His immune system can't fight it off in his current state." She looked up, meeting Charles's eyes through the window. "Charles, we need to be realistic. Even if we get him to the sanctuary, the odds of him surviving the next 48 hours are—" "Don't," Charles interrupted. "Don't tell me the odds." Elena held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. She returned her attention to the lion, adjusting the IV flow, checking his airways, doing everything she could with the limited equipment bouncing along a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. Charles turned back to face forward, his hands gripping his knees. He'd made this choice, thrown away his career, broken the law, dragged all these people into an operation that might end with nothing but a dead lion and a list of charges. For what? For an animal he'd met 6 hours ago? For a creature that by all rational measures was already beyond saving? But when he closed his eyes, he saw those amber eyes staring at him through the cage bars, that look of recognition, of waiting, of something that felt impossibly like trust. The lion had survived 730 days in that cage, not because he was strong enough, his wasted body proved he wasn't, but because he hadn't given up, because somewhere in his animal consciousness he'd decided that survival mattered, that tomorrow might bring change, that waiting was worth it. Charles understood that kind of waiting. He'd spent 10 years waiting for something to feel meaningful again, for some moment that would remind him why he'd chosen this work in the first place. He'd been going through the motions, filing reports, following protocols, slowly calcifying into someone who measured suffering by spreadsheets and triage protocols. The lion had looked at him and seen something Charles had forgotten was there. The person who still believed that one life mattered, that individual suffering wasn't just a statistic, that keeping a promise meant something even when it was impossible. "Joseph," Charles said quietly, "is there any way to make this road smoother? Not unless you want me to drive through the bush, and that's even worse. But," he squinted into the darkness, "there's a paved road about 20 kilometers east. It adds an hour to the journey, but it's smooth." Charles didn't hesitate. "Take it." "Charles," Elena called out, "an extra hour could—" "I know, but if we keep hitting these bumps, we'll kill him before we get there anyway. Take the paved road, Joseph." The truck turned east, leaving the direct route for a longer but gentler path. In the back, the monitor's beeping steadied slightly. Elena caught Charles's eye and gave him a small nod. Not agreement, just acknowledgement that he'd made a choice and she'd respect it. They drove in silence for a while,
the truck's engine providing a steady rhythm beneath the vast African night. Stars emerged overhead, countless and indifferent. The universe didn't care about one dying lion. It didn't measure meaning by individual lives. It operated on scales too vast for single stories to matter. But Charles had stopped caring what the universe thought. He'd spent too long trying to see things from that cosmic perspective, trying to accept that some suffering was inevitable, that you couldn't save everyone, so you shouldn't destroy yourself trying to save anyone. The lion had reminded him that the cosmic perspective was worthless when you're looking into eyes that were counting on you. That meaning wasn't something you found in grand scales, it was something you created in single moments, in impossible choices, in the refusal to let one more broken promise add to the weight of a broken world. "Paved road ahead," Joseph announced. The truck's tires hit smooth asphalt, and the brutal bouncing stopped. Almost immediately, the monitor's beeping steadied slightly. Elena caught Charles's eye and gave him a small nod. Not agreement, just acknowledgement that he'd made a choice and she'd respect it. The checkpoint appeared out of nowhere. A makeshift barrier of oil drums and wooden planks stretched across the paved road. Joseph hit the brakes, and the truck shuddered to a stop. 3 men emerged from the shadows at the roadside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They weren't wearing uniforms. That was the first thing Charles noticed. The second was the rifles slung over their shoulders. "This isn't an official checkpoint," Joseph said quietly, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. One of the men approached the driver's side, his flashlight beam sweeping across the truck's interior before moving to the bed. When the light found the lion, the man's expression shifted from bored authority to sharp interest. "Well," he said in Swahili, a smile spreading across his face, "what do we have here?" Charles's stomach dropped. He opened his door and stepped out, positioning himself between the man and the truck. "We're transporting an injured animal to a wildlife sanctuary. We have authorization." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The man laughed, a sound without humor. "Authorization? In the middle of the night on a back road with no official vehicles?" He called to his companions. "Boys, come see what we've caught." The other 2 approached. One was older, possibly the leader, with a scar running down his left cheek. The other was young, barely 20, but his eyes held the kind of hardness that came from doing terrible things and learning to live with them. "A male lion," the scarred man said, his flashlight playing across the sedated animal. "Black market value for his bones and organs may be $30,000, more if we can sell him alive to a private collector." He turned to Charles. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave the lion with us. You're going to drive away and forget you ever saw this animal, and in exchange, we won't report you for illegal wildlife trafficking."
"No," Charles said simply. The scarred man's expression hardened. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in." "I understand perfectly." Charles's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through him. "You're thieves. You patrol this road looking for easy targets, and you think a dying lion is worth $30,000 to the right buyer." He took a step forward. "But he's not yours to take." The younger man unslung his rifle, not quite pointing it at Charles, but making the threat clear. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Elena stood up in the truck bed, her hands raised. "Please, he's barely alive. The stress of another transfer will kill him. Just let us pass." "Get down," the scarred man ordered. "Both of you, away from the truck." Charles didn't move. Behind him, he heard Elena checking the monitor, heard her sharp intake of breath. "Charles," she said urgently, "the sedative is wearing off. His heart rate is spiking." "How long?" Charles asked without turning around. "Minutes, maybe less." The scarred man pulled out a satellite phone. "I'm calling my buyer now. He can be here in an hour with cash." He gestured with his rifle toward the side of the road. "Move, now." Charles looked at the 3 armed men, at the rifles that could end his life in an instant, at the casual cruelty in their faces. He thought about walking away, about letting them have the lion, about surviving this night and finding some other cause, some other moment to make his stand. But then he thought about Mama Nyeri's tears, about 2 years of villagers sharing their scraps to keep this animal alive, about a promise he'd made 6 hours ago when he'd knelt beside a rusted cage and looked into amber eyes that were waiting for someone to finally do the right thing. "No," Charles said again, and didn't move. The younger man raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Charles's chest. Last chance. Behind them, a low sound emerged from the truck bed. Not quite a growl, not quite a moan, something between animal pain and animal rage. The lion was waking up. "Elena, get clear," Charles said quietly. "Charles, don't! Get clear!" Elena scrambled out of the truck bed just as the lion's eyes opened. For a moment, the animal was disoriented, confused by the voices and lights in the open space around him. His massive head lifted, swaying slightly as his consciousness fought through the fog of sedation. The poachers saw him move. The younger man swung his rifle toward the lion. "Don't shoot him dead," the scarred man barked. "He's worth nothing dead." But the lion wasn't looking at the poachers. He was looking at Charles. Those amber eyes locked onto the one face he recognized, the one presence that had promised freedom, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, choice. The lion tried to stand. His legs trembled, barely able to support his weight. He was dying, broken, should have been helpless. Every rational thought said he should collapse back down, should save his remaining strength for simple survival. Instead, he lurched forward, placing his emaciated body between Charles and the armed men. The transformation was instant. 3 hardened poachers, armed and experienced, took involuntary steps backward when confronted with a lion that should have been too weak to move, but was somehow standing, somehow growling deep in his chest, somehow radiating a threat that his physical state couldn't possibly back up. "Jesus," the younger man breathed, his rifle wavering. The lion swayed on his feet, his breathing labored, but he didn't back down. He'd chosen protection over survival, loyalty over self-preservation, a dying king defending the human who'd freed him from his cage. Charles felt something break open inside him, awe and gratitude and a bone-deep understanding that he was witnessing something that transcended species, that spoke to some fundamental truth about what it meant to refuse to abandon those who'd refused to abandon you. The scarred man raised his rifle slowly, his expression calculating. "Move the lion, or I put him down." The lion's growl deepened, his claws, overgrown from 2 years without use, scraped against the asphalt. He took 1 shaky step forward, and the poachers took 2 steps back. For a long moment, no one moved. 3 armed men facing a starving lion and unarmed aid worker on a dark road where no one would witness what happened next. Then from somewhere in the darkness beyond the roadblock, headlights appeared, a vehicle approaching fast. The scarred man swore, lowering his rifle. "Move the barrier," he snapped to his companions. "Now!" The poachers scattered, dragging the oil drums aside, disappearing into the bush like the thieves they were. Within seconds, they were gone, swallowed by the African night. The approaching vehicle, a legitimate police patrol, slowed as it reached them, an officer leaning out to check if they needed assistance. Charles, barely able to form words, explained they were transporting an injured animal. The officer, tired and uninterested in paperwork, waved them on. As Joseph restarted the truck, Charles turned to the lion. The animal had collapsed back onto the blankets, his brief surge of strength completely spent. His breathing was shallow, rapid, but his eyes found Charles one more time before exhaustion pulled them closed. "Thank you," Charles whispered. "You didn't have to do that." But maybe the lion did. Maybe, after 730 days of waiting, he'd finally found something worth fighting for, someone who'd kept their promise, someone worth protecting, even at the cost of the last strength he had left. The fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving Charles hollow-eyed but clear-minded. He sat by the enclosure's edge, watching the lion pace the perimeter with methodical precision. 43 steps north, turn 43 steps south.
The pattern never varied. "You remember, don't you?" Charles whispered. The lion stopped mid-stride, golden eyes fixed at him with an intelligence that made Charles's breath catch. In that moment, the years collapsed. He was 26 again, freshly arrived in Kenya, still believing his master's degree in international development could save the world. The poaching incident had happened his second week. A mother lion shot, her cub cowering in the brush, too young to survive alone. Charles had bottle-fed that cub for 3 months before the wildlife authorities transferred it to a proper facility. He'd been so proud of himself then, so certain he was making a difference. He'd moved on to the next crisis, the next grant proposal, the next carefully worded report that changed nothing. But this lion had waited. In some animal way Charles couldn't fully comprehend, it had waited for him to remember who he used to be. Dr. Osei found him there at dawn, still pressed against the fence. "The permits came through," she said quietly. "The sanctuary's ready. We can transport him tomorrow." Charles nodded, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. "You should come," Dr. Osei continued. "See him settled. The sanctuary director says volunteers are always welcome. I have a flight back to Johannesburg in 3 days." "I know." The lion had finally stopped pacing. It lay in the center of the enclosure, head on its paws, watching Charles with those ancient amber eyes. Charles thought about his apartment in Johannesburg, the consultant contracts waiting in his inbox, the empty-hearted Tinder dates, and the expensive whiskey, and the careful architecture of a life designed to feel nothing too deeply. But this lion had waited. In some animal way Charles couldn't fully comprehend, it had waited for him to remember who he used to be. The fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving Charles hollow-eyed but clear-minded. He sat by the enclosure's edge, watching the lion pace the perimeter with methodical precision. 43 steps north, turn 43 steps south. The pattern never varied. "You remember, don't you?" Charles whispered. The lion stopped mid-stride, golden eyes fixed at him with an intelligence that made Charles's breath catch. In that moment, the years collapsed. He was 26 again, freshly arrived in Kenya, still believing his master's degree in international development could save the world. The poaching incident had happened his second week. A mother lion shot, her cub cowering in the brush, too young to survive alone. Charles had bottle-fed that cub for 3 months before the wildlife authorities transferred it to a proper facility. He'd been so proud of himself then, so certain he was making a difference. He'd moved on to the next crisis, the next grant proposal, the next carefully worded report that changed nothing. But this lion had waited. In some animal way Charles couldn't fully comprehend, it had waited for him to remember who he used to be. The fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving Charles hollow-eyed but clear-minded. He sat by the enclosure's edge, watching the lion pace the perimeter with methodical precision. 43 steps north, turn 43 steps south. The pattern never varied. "You remember, don't you?" Charles whispered. The lion stopped mid-stride, golden eyes fixed at him with an intelligence that made Charles's breath catch. In that moment, the years collapsed. He was 26 again, freshly arrived in Kenya, still believing his master's degree in international development could save the world. The poaching incident had happened his second week. A mother lion shot, her cub cowering in the brush, too young to survive alone. Charles had bottle-fed that cub for 3 months before the wildlife authorities transferred it to a proper facility. He'd been so proud of himself then, so certain he was making a difference. He'd moved on to the next crisis, the next grant proposal, the next carefully worded report that changed nothing. But this lion had waited. In some animal way Charles couldn't
We appreciate you seeing the entire story. You will definitely enjoy the following story if you liked this one. As you may imagine, it's more bizarre and fascinating. To view the next one, click on the image that is currently displayed on the screen.